this will have taken place, but the place, except perhaps a constellation. Nothing of the memorable crisis will have taken place. The memorable crisis is the exquisite crisis of free verse, from which nothing will escape unless matter, classical among all, can extract itself victoriously from it. The danger would be for Mallarme that one of the two forms of verse should drown the other. On the contrary, the two forms have to coexist in some original fashion. When we read the coup de dé, we cannot see a priori anything but an exacerbated explosion of free verse. Could there be some way for a metric to be inserted into a poem apparently so much in rupture with all the old rules? Mitsurona proposed an ingenious solution to this question, attempting to demonstrate that the coup de dé is an encrypted eulogy to the Alexandrine. But before discussing his solution, we must take a detour via another text, unfinished, like Igitur, and written during the course of the preceding decade. This text, written in the decade 1885-1895, is known as the Notes for Book. The will to maintain a metric on the terrain of free verse, we can see an example in Mallarme in this untitled body of texts that Bertrand Marchal called the Notes for the Book. We know that Mallarme was obsessed his whole life with the writing of an absolute book, the great work which, in a public letter to Verlaine, he called Orphic Explanation of the Earth. Orphic Explanation of the Earth. This obsession also must be understood in the framework of the religion of art. Mallarme very seriously tried to write a text that could replace the Bible with advantage. We might think that he was being ironic here, given the hubristic dimension of such a project. But this is, I believe, to misunderstand him. For this project was so far from being out of reach that, according to me, he wholly succeeded in it. In any case, according to his own criteria for success. But only in the coup de dé, as we shall see. I maintain that the coup de dé alone realized the whole project of the book, but via a wholly new route. In the notes for the book, then, Mallarme describes a ceremony of reading that is quite obviously designed to replace, in the future, the Catholic Mass. Everything is strange in this ceremony. We see a room with assistants, seated before a scene, and on the scene, two pieces of furniture, two racks, containing loose-leaf pages, which, I quote, an operator, as anonymous as a priest, takes up and joins one to another according to a combinatory so complex that the reading of the rule book would take place over a period of 5 years. Now the reader of these notes cannot but be struck by numerological obsession that is deployed throughout them. For the manuscript is essentially composed of numbers, of calculations on numbers, of measurements as to the material and financial aspects of the book, of various quantities involved in the ceremonial context of its reading. These numbers have an obvious link to the Alexandrine. There must, for example, be 24 assistants in the reading room, 12 by 2. And the size and the price of the book are also linked to multiples or divisors of 12. The price is very important. No, these notes for the book are written between 1888 and 1895. Thus, precisely during the period of the crisis of free verse. That is to say, during this period when Mallarme reflected the most intensely upon the nature of this crisis. It thus seems clear what Mallarme is seeking to do with these strange calculations. The poet perceives that the Alexandrine is being driven from the poetical text by free verse. Free verse seems to demonstrate that the 12 is contingent for poetry. Mallarme thus attempts in response to reinstate a necessity for this number 12. The 12 takes refuge in the material surroundings of the text and in the context of its reading, size, price, number of volumes, assistance, and so on. And the 12 no longer concerns the content of the text. We understand that the poet seeks a way to reinsert the metric, the count, into poetry by finding new functions for meter. But this count has nothing to do with what it previously signified. It is a wholly new number. If not in its count, it is still 12, at least in its functioning, since it no longer enumerates the syllables of the verse. Nevertheless, it is hard to see how this procedure of enumeration is meant to have saved the Alexandrine and restored its necessity. But what is interesting for our purposes is to ask whether the coup de dé did not continue this counting madness, but in making it far more effective, through the writing of a poem that, however apparently non-metrical, would contain within itself, in its very composition, numbers that are not immediately visible, but that would constitute the result of the master's throw. The master would have admitted that the waves of free verse were destined to visibly engulf metrical poetry, including the coup de dé. However, in this poem, there would have existed a metrical principle, not immediately accessible, but underlying its composition. If this is what Mallarme did, then the coup de dé could no longer be considered as a radicalization of free verse, but must be understood as a metamorphosis of metrical verse. The coup de dé would not have pushed one step further the rupture with classical constraints, but would have tried to reinvent the latter. Mallarme would then have written what I would willingly call a poem in essential verse, a verse neither free nor metrical in the old manner, but capable of uniting radicalized free verse and a reinvigorated metrical verse. This would be a poem we could call hypermetric. In the guise of being hyper-free, it would be yet more rule-governed than a classical verse, but according to a rule encrypted within the poem itself. According to Rona, the principle of encrypting the number 12 in the notes was indeed transmitted to the coup de dé. The coup de dé consists of 24 pages, the equivalent of 12 double pages. Now 24 is the number of syllables of a distich of rhymed alexandrines. Moreover, the statement that announces the number, l'unique nombre qui ne peut pas être un autre, the unique number that can be no other, itself contains 12 syllables. Rona even believed that the number 12 was hidden in the layout of the page and the typographical style of the characters used. But the study of the proofs and of Mallarme's correspondence with his editor has shown that this is not at all the case. I do not believe anyhow that the meter encrypted in the poem is the Alexandrine, because this would have been a rearguard action. And in truth, it is hard to see how such a play on the 12 would have conferred a new necessity upon it. If the coup de dé eulogizes a necessary matter, praises a necessary matter, capable of resisting the submergence of rivers, it must be not traditional, but on the contrary, novel enough to possess in a way that still remains enigmatic for us, the necessity that the ancient Alexandrine had lost. Certainly, Mallarme continues to pay homage to the Alexandrine and never denies it, but all the same he intends, in the context of the crisis, to replace it without annulling it with a poetical number of unprecedented properties. But if the unique number is not 12, then what could it be? Page 11. Let's ask ourselves to start with whether some number or cipher appears explicitly in the poem. Now, if you go to the page 11, you will see that the only cipher that appears, written out in the coup de dé, is 7. The final throw of dice that compensates for the failed throw of the master gives rise, if you remember, to a septentrion, to a stellar 7 that seems to mark a possible success of the voyage despite the surrounding disaster. What could the 7 symbolize for Mallarme? We know that the sonnet is composed of 14 verses, that is of 7 rhymes, and we know that it is Mallarme's preferred fixed form. 7 is also a symbol of septentrion as both containing the stellar north and being composed of hazardous dissemination of stars. Hazard is the heavenly north of the poet. So the 7 is the link between the perfect fixed form, the sonnet, and eternal heavenly hazard. However, the 7 is no more poetically interesting than the 12, because it doesn't contain a specific necessity as a matter. For the moment, we have resolved nothing, of course. We obtain nothing particularly interesting by this 7. But before going further, let us ask already if we can find in the last page, the page 11, the page where the septentrion emerges, a clue to the meaning of the metrical count governing the whole of the coup de dé and placed under the aegis of the stellar 7. We read, running from the penultimate to the final page, the second great announcement of the poem. Nothing will have taken place but a place, except perhaps a constellation. This constellation is said to be called with neglect and desuetude. Not insofar, I quote, as it numbers on some vacant and higher surface that is in the stellar sky, but also on the vacant surface of the page, the successive impact starrily of a total count in the making. That is to say, of a total count that is in the process of being produced in this very moment as we read the poem. I quote, keeping watch, doubting, rolling, shining, and meditating before finally halting at some last point by which it is consecrated. Every thought emits a throw of dice. Well, I believe that what is described here is that there is a metrical count, a total count in the making, that is in the process of being summed, of being totalized, as the readers arrives at the end of the poem, and that will be completed by a consecration. In metrical poetry, the count is obviously always completed at the end of the verse. It is when I read the end of an Alexandrine